Welcome to Living Light Network and a very special Thursday broadcast. Well, how do you like your weather? Natural or man-made? That's what you're going to find out today, because you're going to find out that your weather really isn't so natural, and the man-made part is probably about 95% of the equation, at least if you live in the industrialized world, which includes Europe and here in North America and even Central America, some parts of South America. Our weather is not natural anymore. And I have a guest on this special broadcast, Rosalind Peterson, who will be on shortly, who has studied this for years. She said she was retired, and she retired from her normal world job, but I think she's a whole lot less than retired now than she ever thought she'd be. In fact, she's working harder at bringing out truth about what's going on in our atmosphere, much harder now than she ever did when she had her real job. So just to introduce a little bit about what we're going to talk about, Rosalind has declared this month, May 2011, as atmospheric and geoengineering. I'll get this right. Let's start again. Atmospheric Geoengineering Awareness Month. And it happens to be May 2011 right now. And she declared it for a reason. Now, there's a misleading word that a lot of people use. They claim we have chemtrails. What you're going to find out today is that is a very misleading term. It's way beyond chemical trails in the sky. It's way beyond that. And if you're in our chat, you can see right now all the sites where Rosalind has all this information. Let me just say I'm on the air for those who are listening in archives. Go on the internet to CaliforniaSkywatch.com. And then a second site with just as much, actually more information, is another site that Rosalind has put up, Agriculture Defense Coalition. These are all just one word, agriculturedefensecoalition.com. And then you also have the one I just mentioned, California Skywatch, one word, californiaskywatch.com. If you want to get informed of what's really in the atmosphere and understand exactly how it's man-made and has nothing to do with natural weather, then you need to go to those sites. There's more information than you could absorb in a week on those two sites. I want to mention something real quick before. I'm sorry, I made a mistake, and I just got told. It's agriculturedefensecoalition.org, O-R-G, not .com. agriculturedefensecoalition.org. All right, and there's also californiaskywatch.com. All right, before I introduce my fantastic guest who thinks that she's retired, now is probably busier than she's ever been since she thought she retired. I found something that I don't even know if this is on her sites. I didn't see it. All of you have heard of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. Okay, yeah, it's not conspiracy theory, anything. If you want to find that organization, just go on the internet. Go to www.cfr.org, and you can find out that they really do exist. Well, they have something on there that I thought was really interesting, considering that this is our geoengineering atmospheric month, as Rosalind has declared. I saw on there something that came from March 10th of last year, 2010. And it's on the CFR site. This is the title, Developing an International Framework for Geoengineering. And I'm going to be honest, I never heard the term geoengineering until Rosalind was my guest almost a month ago here on Living Light Network. And I was on my Blue Plague show where we were talking about how the weather is manipulated and also how it affects the Gulf of Mexico with their lies that's going on now, their big cover-up. But this comes from the actual CFR.org site. I don't know why they say .org. That should be .com. But it's from March 10th, 2010, and it's in their climate change section. And they had a gentleman on there that this is all in print, and it's also been in videos. I've seen it on YouTube. M. Granger Morgan, who is the head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Now, there's a big research university. Well, he came out with some really weird things during this particular March 10th last year, 2010, meeting that they had with the CFR. And I thought, this is really, really, really odd. I had never seen this before. I was doing some searches today to try to find out some of the things that Rosalind would possibly talk about. Like I said, on her site, she's got so much information. You're never, in a week, you're not going to get through it all. So let me quote the Council on Foreign Relations from March 10th, 2010, with their meeting on developing an international framework for geoengineering. And this is a quote from the gentleman I just mentioned. First of all, of course, there's a lot of money getting spent to make sure that a very substantial portion of the public stays totally confused about this. And he was talking specifically about geoengineering. And I mean, it's been really quite pernicious, but there's been literally tens of millions of dollars spent on every little thing that comes along that might, relate to some uncertainty. And that's the end of his quote. You know what he's saying? Tens of millions of dollars are spent on misinformation about geoengineering, especially when it comes to the climate. And that's what their meeting was all about. Again, this is not a secret. Just go to their site. Then you find out for yourself. It's right there on the internet, www.cfr.org. And look under their climate change section. And it's the title of it is Developing International Framework Geoengineering. If you want to get technical, it's on page 21651. Anyway, it's there now. Maybe after this broadcast to make sure that it's not there. I don't know. But that's what today's show is all about. I had Rosalind on here, like I said, almost a month ago. But let's put it this way. She really couldn't mention a percent of what she knows in 2 hours. And let's consider this part 2, and it will also deal, besides the atmospheric geoengineering awareness, we'll also deal with what's going to happen with hurricane season this month in the Gulf, because that's my thing. That's my show on every Friday. You can catch me tomorrow on Friday with a Gulf Blue Plague update right here on Blog Talk Radio at Living Light Network. So, without wasting any more time so that you can get all the info that you need, I've got Rosalind here alive now. And Rosalind, I didn't find what I just mentioned on your site. I got a feeling it's there, but that just amazed me. That March 10th from last year, they were talking about hiding the facts of geoengineering in the skies.
That's correct. And hello, and thank you for having me on your show again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on because I learned a lot last show, and I can't wait to learn more now.
Well, this is a fascinating subject, and it's a subject that has been talked about since the 1990s when it was introduced by Edward Teller of Lawrence Livermore Lab and some other gentlemen, and they started writing papers about this years ago, thinking that they could put chemicals or particles into the sky for various types of experiments. One of them, which is to supposedly reduce global warming by putting particles and chemicals into the atmosphere to reduce the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And this atmospheric geoengineering has actually been going on for some time because we see the skies filled with jet contrails from one end to the other, and a lot of times they put so much cloud cover up, which NASA talks about in their studies. And NASA has said that persistent jet contrails do turn into man-made clouds. They do exacerbate global warming. They do change the climate, and they do negatively impact natural resources. And the Stanford University studies, which I put some of them on my website, I also attended last month the Commonwealth Club Symposium on this subject, and we talked about geoengineering there. But we talked about the impact that this reduction of direct sunlight is having on the Earth, on agriculture, on crop production, water and air pollution. And so now we have a group of so-called climate scientists who are actively engaged in promoting geoengineering schemes so that they can put up these particles like sulfur or aluminum possibly into the atmosphere so that they can reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. They are talking about cloud whitening experiments where they put salt, finely ground salt particulates into clouds, and then those clouds become more reflective and white and reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. And then finally these salt particles rain out over land, and they pollute our water and our soil and our forest land because salt water starts to make the land and the soils unproductive and requires more. It's going to change the fishing for freshwater fishing and other things as these particles rain out more and more over land areas. So the experiments are in the oceans. Ocean iron fertilization has also been underway by both private companies and experimental projects, and they're finding that it's a disaster in the oceans because it's creating these artificial algae blooms which kill the fish and don't do what they say they're going to do. In other words, reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. They actually cause other types of problems. So the ocean iron fertilization has been kind of stalled a little bit, although private companies can still do this without public consent, government consent. The U.S. House Science and Technology Committee started to hold hearings along with the U.K. Parliament in England in 2009, and they only had climate scientists who wanted to do these type of projects testify before them. They didn't ask scientists from any other fields. For example, they didn't have anyone represented from agriculture, no one represented from fish and game, no one represented from, in other words, ocean scientists, marine biologists.
Of course not.
They had nobody testify either at the UK Parliament or at the U.S. House Science and Technology hearings, of which 3 have been held since 2009. And they had decided that they would only have those testify who wanted to promote these experiments. And the UK Parliament report, which came out on March 10th, 2010, the 5th report, even talked about the fact that they had initiated some of these geoengineering experiments without public notification, without public consent, no oversight, nothing. That they had started to use our atmosphere as a giant physics laboratory to conduct their experiments. Now that means that we here in the United States are the human guinea pigs for these types of experiments. And one of the things that I can say without a doubt is that when you read the U.S. House Science and Technology Report, which came out in October 2010, or if you read anything about global geoengineering governance, they're talking about having some sort of governance so that they can go ahead and experiment on the Earth's atmosphere and on us, and that these projects have unintended consequences. For example, if you put sulfur up, then you're going to have acid rain, which is going to impact your forests. The acid rain will change the pH in your rivers and streams. It's going to cause loss of crop production. When you remove direct sunlight from reaching the Earth, which the jets are already doing when they produce the man-made clouds and haze, you're going to have, in other words, it's not likely to cool us down, but you're going to have more problems in increasing asthma, other types of health problems. These chemicals are toxic. They're going to get into our rivers, streams, and soils. They're going to make the land unproductive. And in reducing the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth, you're going to have lower crop production right away because you won't have photosynthesis, the process whereby the sun, direct sunlight, hits the Earth, and the plants take up this direct sunlight, and it turns the sunlight into energy, which allows the plant to grow and be strong. Solar panel power production is already being interrupted by the amount of man-made clouds that are in our skies.
Wow.
So you're having sharp reductions in areas where people have put in solar panels on their homes, on their wells. People have said, look, we can help the environment, we can put up solar panels, we can get ourselves off the grid, we can become self-sufficient, we can put in gardens and all these things, and yet we have a government run amok that is allowing all these atmospheric experiments to continue and plans more of them. Mm-hmm. And this is why I introduced this month a Geoengineering Awareness Month, so that people could begin to understand that this is a serious discussion, that these plans have already been implemented in some areas and in some ways, and that more is planned, and that we have the right to say no to these experiments, that we don't want to interrupt a process between the sun and the earth that has gone on for billions of years and that has allowed life to flourish here. And now we have scientists who've decided that they're going to play God, essentially, and they're saying, well, if we put, if these experiments go awry and there's some, disaster from having more asthma or more acid rain kill the trees or some other goings on, well, that's just because we have to experiment because we are the gods and we're going to take control of the Earth's environment and the atmosphere, and we have to experiment. Well, no, they don't.
Of course. Well, that's part of the control thing. You said contrails in the beginning. All right, I'm an old military guy. A contrail means a condensation trail, and it came from the exhaust of whether it was a prop or a jet aircraft, and it would dissipate after a while. Those are the ones that you could see the plane fly in the sky, and about not too far after, you would see that white plume coming from the engine, and then all of a sudden it would just disappear, and that was a condensation trail from combustion. But we have something new now, and even though you refer to it as contrails, in the technical term it's not a condensation trail. We have something new, and these supposed condensation trails don't disappear. They turn into something else. And like I said in the beginning, the term chemtrail, I think, is very, very misleading, and that's what everybody's calling this new contrail. Could you explain that? Because it's not just chemical. Explain what they're doing up there for the primary part of why this is not really necessarily chemical.
Well, what happens is that when you have a contrail of any size, short, long, everything, in that contrail, in other words, coming from all kinds of different types of jet engines and propeller engines, at certain elevations you would have what they call a normal contrail, and it would dissipate within a very short period of time. It wouldn't last for, as they do now, one contrail can cover 4,000 square kilometers from one plane, can last up to 20 hours. This was unheard of. In other words, even during World War II, this was unheard of. You had contrails and they would disappear within a certain period of time. They didn't cover entire skies and last and have one just last for up to 20 hours. This you wouldn't see. So there's been a change in that the contrails, for one thing, always contain particulates, soot, toxic chemicals that you don't see when you look up at this, but they're loaded with jet fuel emissions, and they're loaded with particulates. And the combustion of engines, one of the things it puts into the atmosphere is water vapor, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas. And that's why NASA, when it talks about these trails now lasting for a long time, turning into man-made clouds that persist for up to 20 hours and cover 4,000 square kilometers, by the way. These things are not what we used to see or identify in our skies. They were non-existent. Nothing lasted that long. So in the late 1980s, or somewhere thereabouts, there was a change. And there was a change in that contrails all of a sudden began to leave more white haze. And they began to persist in ways that, for the moment, lasted for hours and hours. And we see jets doing loops and circles and ovals and all kinds of things in the sky, covering the skies here. For example, in Mendocino County, they can do a blue sky and cover it over in 3 hours flat. Just because they have a number of jets working us over and circling our county until they just absolutely put these huge expanding plumes over us and just cover the whole sky so that there's no direct sunlight reaching the earth. And this is the way they keep the skies over Mendocino County and other surrounding counties here in Northern California most of the time, as well as other areas across the United States. I have a friend who was just in Florida who was talking about the jets working an area in Florida over pretty badly in the last few weeks as well. And they had just jet after jet leaving the trails.
Well, that's true. I can even say it in south of the Tampa area. Oh, boy, the last few days we've had this haze, which they have called an ozone layer. Actually, it was a high pressure, and though there was some ozone, I saw some peaks in all this through the haze, and there was crisscrossing above the haze of these new contrails, which are not just condensation any longer from combustion. It's just amazing. They were crisscrossed, and that was only a small peak I had. So, yeah, Florida's getting nailed. And we'll talk. Let's talk about that a little bit later, about specifically Florida, because that's my thing. I live here, and with what's going on in the Gulf, that's kind of important. Why we're not going to have hurricanes for a second season. Everybody's going to think we're nuts, but it's manipulated. It is deliberate. I have a kind of a question. Okay, going back to the term chemtrail, that is a very misleading term, and I know you just spoke about it a little bit. What besides what people think is chemicals in there, what are the military and other such experiments, as they call it, going on? And let's even, whether it's California or Florida or Maine, what are the things that have been found in these new contrails that aren't necessarily chemical, which again, it's a misleading term?
Well, first I'd like to go back a little bit in history about the term chemtrail.
Okay.
It actually showed up somewhere between 1994 and 1996 on the U.S. Air Force website. And the term was identified as a hoax. The term in 1996, and that's the earliest reference, although they referenced studies prior to that on the links that I put up on my website under U.S. Air Force. But what was interesting about chemtrails is chemtrails came up as a hoax. And I thought it very strange when I began to research this what was going on in the skies in 2002, that this term, chemtrails, when I went on to the U.S. Air Force website, right away they said, well, they had done investigations and university studies back in the 1990s, and that they had concluded in 1996 that this was all normal, everything was wonderful, and that anyone using the term chemtrail was involved in some sort of belief in a hoax or a conspiracy theory, essentially. The Air Force was very smart because they didn't tell you which university had investigated or who had investigated for them this term, but
That's
they
typical.
put out the term quite early. Now, NASA turned around, and NASA in the late 1980s decided to initiate a schools program for children K through 12 in both Europe and the United States. And what they did is they began to teach classes in contrail identification and had children participating in looking at contrails because NASA stated, and it's still online, by the way, NASA stated that the best observers of these type of phenomenon were children, and they were using children to identify and catalog these contrails. But I actually believe that what NASA was doing at the time in the late 1980s and early 1990s through early 2005 was teaching a whole generation of children that this type of phenomenon in the sky was quite normal, that it had been around since 1919. I turned this into a PDF file in case it went away.
Excuse me, since 1919, like 1919?
That's correct. That contrails were first seen in 1919. Now, we're
okay, I'm going to laugh with you. That's absurd.
Well, they had to define contrail probably as smoke because there was no such thing in 1919 as contrails. They didn't have jet engines until the end of World War II, as another example. We had mostly propeller airplanes.
Even the regular combustion engines in World War II and the turboprops at the end of World War II left a condensation trail, but not like we have now. This is something totally different.
Yes, but NASA was making the claim to the children that this had been around since 1919. Well, in the first place, in 1919, nobody had the type of equipment to even get high enough, unless they were in a rocket or something. They couldn't get up high enough.
Only the Red Baron.
Only the Red Baron. But, we were in biplanes. And we were in planes that a lot of times didn't even have covering over the top of the pilots and open cockpits and all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
So I found this fascinating, but it's interesting to note that in the late 1980s, both in Europe and here, NASA instigated this program. Now, I found that fascinating because the first time that I ever heard the word chemtrail was in a bill, but that was in 2001 when Dennis Kucinich introduced the term in a U.S. House bill. The term was undefined. It mentioned chemtrail, but it was never defined as to what it meant, what it was. However, the military Air Force at that time, by 2002, had long held, put up the word as a hoax on their website. And the term chemtrail was never defined in any terminology. I do know and have a copy of the U.S. Air Force Academy military handbook on chemistry handbook, and it's called Chemtrails, and it's a normal everyday chemistry handbook which has nothing in it about, in other words, chemtrails per se. It's just talking about chemistry and following different chemistry that you would find in any high school science book. So there was nothing in there talking about chemtrails per se, because I got a copy from my congressman just to find out. But that title came from in 1989, 1990, 1991. I do know that their chemistry handbook at the United States Air Force Academy is titled Chemtrails.
Really?
So I found it fascinating that this word would be declared a hoax long before ever brought up by Dennis Kucinich. And the NASA, NOAA, the EPA, all these agencies got together and decided that they were going to write something about contrails and to tell everybody that chemtrails was a hoax, and that if you used the term, you were one of these gullible believers in conspiracy theories and hoaxes. And therefore, you weren't to be believed because this was ridiculous, this was all normal, natural. All these agencies that investigated put this to rest long ago, and anybody using the term, and this was their discussion years ago, anyone using the term were essentially nutcases.
Or conspiracy theorists.
Yes. So when anybody went to object to what they were seeing the jets doing as not having happened in our skies before, new phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, and this looks like they're spraying, it looks like something is going on that's lasting for hours or days. There's crisscrosses and X's and loops and black contrails and all different types of clouds that are made from these various trails. This was all lumped into people believing in conspiracy theories, and therefore not a single congressman, not a single senator, no one is now or has for almost 30 years responded to anyone complaining about this phenomenon, because they've been told by the military and universities and everybody that this is all normal, natural, and can be expected, and has been happening since 1919.
But then we have what I mentioned in the beginning before you came on from Granger Morgan, from who is the head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and his speech to those in the Council on Foreign Relations on March 10th last year, 2010. He came right out and said there are tens of millions of dollars being spent to basically hoodwink the public. And I have another quote that I didn't mention that is in that speech, which is right on there on CFR.org. Again, it should be .com because, you know, they're not an organization. They're a bunch of political liars. But anyway, he said, and I'm quoting Professor Dr. Granger again, quote, "We do stuff in the atmosphere all the time, of course, and and so it's not as though the stratosphere is absolutely pristine." Oh my gosh, there's an admission that we're putting things in the stratosphere all the time. And it's definitely not pristine. In other words, we have polluted the stratosphere, and they're spending tens of millions of dollars to hide this and misinformation and disinformation. Amazing. Oh
yes, but quite. This is quite true. I mean, this is not something that just appears. This is very true that this is what they're doing, have been doing for a long time, and part of the way that they can obscure it is to use the jets to obscure it, and the jets are a good foil because they can tell everybody that this is all a conspiracy theory or something and that everything is normal. So it's a grand plan on a grand scheme, and I attended an odd meeting in 2006. There was a meeting at Stanford University, and a group of geoengineers held private meetings for a week on geoengineering and other topics. And then they had one day in which they had invited the press or the public to come and attend and hear from some of these speakers about geoengineering. And so they didn't allow the press to bring in cameras, and they only called three members of the press. There was Aljazeera was present. There was the BBC that was present, and a friend of mine who's a radio talk show producer from New York, who was allowed to tape the program but not to put it on video, just record the audio. Well, these geoengineers all got up and spoke on various topics, but they didn't like my questions about what impact it would have on agriculture, or when they had this meeting at NASA Ames, how many scientists spoke about the impact on agriculture or trees or habitat or oceans. They had one speaker who was off topic a little bit and didn't address the main topic that they were dealing with, and that was it. But what they said, quote unquote, is that they had hidden the word geoengineering for practically 25 years or so at that time. And they hadn't put it in any of their papers and research because they felt that if they did, that the public might object to this, and therefore the projects would be stopped before they could be moved forward. And we have this on tape.
Wow. That kind of coincides with what Dr. Granger said in that CFR speech. Here's something else. It agrees with what you're saying. And I'm quoting again. But I don't think it's too early to anticipate the possibility of a situation arising in which suddenly there is a great deal more fear than there currently is, coming much more rapidly than the scientists anticipate checking. And at that point, we could have a real mess on our hands if there are no rules whatsoever. So what I'm saying is anticipate the need for having a basic principle, which is thou shalt not mess with the atmosphere unless everybody agrees in some global representative way. In other words, he's saying this is agreed with other nations. This is a global agreement, which has got to include countries in Europe, North America, Japan, Asia, Russia. This is a global agreement. You know, they're messing around with our atmosphere. As he said, thou shalt not mess with the atmosphere unless everybody agrees in some globally representative way. So, Rosalind, what are they doing with the atmosphere besides their experiments? Are they trying to reflect rays from the sun because the sun has gotten hotter or something? What's going on?
No, I don't think that the sun has gotten hotter. It's what happens is the sun and the earth have been in this relationship for many years. And the NASA scientists say, no, the sun isn't getting hotter. In other words, that the sun has been, they can see the sun better and they have more satellites up so they can see different things that are going on with the sun. But the sun has been acting like this for this, about the same for all the years that, you know, long before mankind came into existence here. So I don't think it has anything to do with the sun or whatever. I think it has to do with the fact that they want to conduct atmospheric and other types of experiments. They now have the money or can get the money if they can conduct the experiments. And I think that it's a bunch of corporations and individuals like Bill Gates, for example, who want to fund these programs and who want to experiment. And so what they're talking about, though, is that there's going to be a lot of harm, and that Ken Caldeira and Gregory Benford from Ken Caldeira from Stanford University and Gregory Benford from UC Irvine here in California have all said, well, we can experiment, and if a few people are impacted, well, the experiment is more important than impacting a few people here or there. And that since we're the gods and we're going to save everyone, that if a few people, you know, a few things happen, why, that's just part of the experiment. and that we have the right to experiment on the populations of the United States and the world. And that's why they're looking at global geoengineering governance, is what they call it now.
Yeah, well, they are. They're performing that because they've all agreed. That comes from the quote from that I just said. And let me give another one. John D. Steinbrunner, who's the director of the Center for International and Security Studies, University of Maryland. Let me run down here and give you his quote during that Council of Foreign Relations speech. He said, quote, "You put particles up and they come down within a year or two." End quote. You put particles up. Geoengineering. Okay, explain that better, Rosalind, because I'm not an engineer, and though you're really not either, but you studied this so well. You don't have to have a degree to be able to know what's going on when you really study something. What the heck is this geoengineering worldwide supposed to accomplish? What is this all about? What's their goal?
Well, their stated goal is to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth in order to cool us down temporarily so that we can continue to pollute at current and escalating levels, and that we can just put on a carbon tax. Everybody will feel good about paying the carbon tax, and that we can continue to pollute, and then they'll put up this artificial dust cloud over us that has to be renewed all the time, because you can never stop putting these particles and chemicals into the air, because if you do, then there'll be dire consequences, because we've been allowing things to pollute here without reducing them. That is the theory.
All right, so big question. What happens?
They don't talk about this as being a fix. They say, well, this is a temporary fix until we can fix the problem.
Okay, what happens if you let nature take its course and you don't do this kind of interference with the stratosphere and such? You don't put this shield up, which I guess is what they're trying to accomplish, to reflect the sunlight. What happens if nature takes its course? Is it so bad? Why are they trying to be gods with this?
Well, here's what I think. If you put up a shield over us, or you put chemicals or particles, I think it's more for warfare experimentation, is what I think is really going on. It's a way to conduct atmospheric experiments, and it's just like over the East Coast when the U.S. Navy put an aluminum oxide dust cloud all the way from the Gulf of Mexico over Maine, using a rocket, and they completely covered the eastern seaboard of the United States in this aluminum oxide dust cloud. They knew fully well it was going to come back, pollute the oceans, pollute the land, and yet to conduct some university experiments, they deliberately put this up. And I even have, they're so proud of it, they went and they recorded what this looked like when they were spraying this and putting up this aluminum oxide dust cloud. The thing is that I think that this has more military application than I do a fix for global warming, in a sense. And I think that this is another way for them to cover up the other atmospheric experiments that they're doing that have a military connotation to them. The U.S. Air Force and the Navy put up the CARE program, C-A-R-E, Charged Aerosol Release Experiment. That's what the CARE program is. And this aluminum oxide dust cloud covered the entire eastern seaboard. People saw it everywhere because they could see it at night. The other issue here is that the U.S. Air Force, for a long time, has been working with NASA, putting up trimethyl aluminum and creating night clouds, what they call night clouds, these chemical reactions in the atmosphere as well. So we've also been using rockets and the space shuttle to conduct barium experiments using barium, strontium, lithium, manganese, magnesium, and other types of experiments where we put these canisters up and create man-made auroras over Alaska and other areas. So all of this is documented in upper atmospheric testing. There's just thousands of documents where they have been doing this and recording the experiments, and so proud, the University of Alaska is so proud that they can now make man-made auroras that look like natural ones because they've now done all these physics experiments. The Navy is very proud that they have put up an artificial ionosphere above us as well, and talk about that in their documents and in Navy, all kinds of Navy documents.
Don't go any further. Explain that. Put up an artificial ionosphere?
Mm-hmm. See, we have different layers above the Earth, okay, and each layer is called something different. And so what they say is from so many miles above the Earth you have, we call it X, and from so many miles above that upward we call it something else. And then when you get up you have, well, see, like troposphere, we've heard of the ionosphere before. Well, the U.S. Navy now has figured out how to put an artificial ionosphere up. In other words, not relying on our normal ionosphere, which has inconsistencies with what it does as time changes, the days go by. But they wanted something consistent that would always have the same reaction when they bounce signals off of it for communications or other things. And so what the Navy did is the Navy actually put up an artificial ionosphere over the Earth.
So how did they do this? What did they put the heavy metals and things up there to reflect so they have radio signals?
Yeah, it's something like that, and I can send you the technical version of it. But and it's on my website, by the way. If anyone goes there and looks up U.S. Navy, you can find where it talks about this artificial ionosphere, and explains it much better than I can.
Well, you got it all there. It's it's all out there for the public to see, no doubt about it. It's like I said, you have more information than somebody could absorb in a week, easily.
No, I'm going to say that there's about 19,000 documents on that site, and it would take you a while to get to it.
24 hours a day out of the whole 7 days, there's more than what somebody could absorb in that time. It's mind-boggling, everything that you've put up there just to make it public so people can see. It's almost too much information because most people aren't going to take the time to look at anything. It's almost like you have to have, some real special headlines or something. But, for somebody who really wants to find out, it's all there.
Well, what I have done, though, to make it easier for people is I've written a series of articles. And in my article section on either Skywatch or the Agriculture Defense Coalition, you can find articles where I summarize geoengineering or solar radiation management, where I talk about these different programs, weather modification, different things. So I've divided this up into categories on the website so people don't have to be so overwhelmed. And sometimes I summarize briefly, but I feel that for me, as I was doing research since 2002, first of all, I had to be able to find a way to categorize all the things I was reading and studying because it was getting overwhelming for me. So I went through, I alphabetized different things by sections. So I have a sunlight section which talks about solar power reduction from man-made clouds produced by the jets. It talks about the lack of vitamin D and the health effects from that geoengineering scheme. It talks about honeybee decline. So you can look up certain things, and so you don't have to be overwhelmed as just being hit with everything in a pile. It's categorized in a way that people can pick out what they want to, or they can read the articles which summarize some of my research.
Whoa, okay. You just mentioned two things that really made the hair on my arm stand up. You talked about honeybee decline and lack of vitamin D. This has to do with what they're doing in the skies?
Yes, some of it does. Honeybees navigate by ultraviolet light, when you keep the sky covered in man-made clouds or particulates and different things, you can disrupt their ability to navigate from their hive to their food supply and back, because NASA studies have clearly shown, and other studies clearly show, that honeybees navigate by using UV radiation. If you start to disrupt this, you could disrupt their ability to not only find food, but get back home and identify it for other members of their clan, because that's how they navigate and communicate.
So this could explain why the bees are dying.
It's one reason. I think that the other has to do with Bayer crop science chemical, a neonicotinoid, which they introduced about the same time as colony collapse disorder started to happen. But I think that both phenomenon would really make a difference, and no one is studying the impact of this man-made cloud cover on honeybee communications due to ultraviolet light being disrupted by some of these programs. And I think that that's something that really needs to be studied as well. But that's how bees do their navigation.
Wow. So the interruption in the ultraviolet, which that's something new I had never known. Wow.
So my honeybee section goes into that, and also the sunlight section. But see, the man-made clouds of this geoengineering program that's ongoing by the jets changes our climate too. And when it reduces the amount of, anytime you start reducing the amount of direct sunlight reaching the earth, you not only lower crop production because your trees and your plants don't have then the strength to grow and be healthy and produce more, they will produce less because the plants are much weaker and can't sustain any kind of level of strong crop production. So that's one area. The second area is that when you reduce the amount of direct sunlight reaching the earth, all the plants, all the trees, everything depends, the oceans, the weather, everything depends on direct sunlight. Even us human beings who rely on tree health for breathing oxygen, we rely on plants for food, we rely on animals who eat the plants, we rely on honeybees. It's an enclosed cycle. When we start to disrupt it and say, well, we're going to lower the amount of direct sunlight reaching the earth, then humans, through their skin and being outdoors, are not absorbing enough vitamin D. Since the advent of the jets leaving these persistent contrails in the late 1980s, which is the earliest I can really find recorded history here in our county and in some other areas where they're obvious, by the 1990s, the CDC was beginning to say, gee, people aren't getting enough vitamin D. There's an epidemic of rickets in children, bone disease. People are having different health effects from lack of vitamin D and direct sunlight reaching them. And so there began to be low IQ. There's some and birth defects in women, children who, when they're pregnant, don't have enough vitamin D. There's a whole host of illnesses that people could be that are experiencing that they don't know that this is from a lack of vitamin D. The problem is, why enrich the pharmaceutical companies and all these companies so that we can buy vitamin D? We can't take enough that makes up for the lack of direct sunlight. It's impossible because our skin acts as a receptor for vitamin D. We have to be outside, but if you're covered over with cloud cover all the time and you're going to have more particles and other things put into the atmosphere to reduce the sunlight, we're not going to have enough to eat. We're going to have more health effects from rickets. Think of this. Children at the turn of the century worked in coal mines during the day instead of going to school. Okay, well, what did they have? They had bone disease and fractures, and they had these health effects from what they called rickets. Well, all of a sudden, we're having fractures in older adults. We're having children with rickets. According to the CDC, Kaiser Permanente, which is a health system here in California and other states as well, and University of California, Berkeley studies, lack of vitamin D is almost an epidemic. And yet no one is looking up. And they say, well, the problem is we have increasing cloud cover. Well, if we just, got rid of these jets, leaving all this man-made cloud cover around, costing us billions of dollars as taxpayers, this would solve the problem. And then we don't have to have geoengineering projects, more of them, to put up more particles and chemicals to not only poison us, but to reduce the amount of sunlight so we have more health effects.
So to make it
makes
worse,
absolutely no sense.
Well, then we've got what has been going on since, at least the early 80s, maybe longer, sunblocks to make sure that we block the sun off our skin. Transdermal sunlight reactions, which is a chemical reaction, is what creates on us transdermally on our skin from the sunlight vitamin D. So if we have sunblocks on top of our skies are being blocked, then how are we supposed to get vitamin D? And that's been the world, well, at least in this country, the big thing. Oh, no, the sun is bad for you. Well, that's not really true. It's part of the misinformation and disinformation. No, your skin needs true sunlight. Not an overexposure, obviously. You don't need to get sunburned, but you need that sun in order for your skin to transdermally create vitamin D. So if we're black with the sky and with sunblocks, it's no wonder we all have a vitamin D deficiency.
Well, even in cases of where you might think you're getting enough sun, even if you don't wear sunblock, the idea that we're going to reduce more sunlight from reaching the earth means that you're going to get even less. And here's the problem. When you start to say, well, this is okay to reduce the amount of sunlight, people don't really understand that this is going to have implications for everything we do. In other words, we can't survive here without direct sunlight reaching the earth. The plants aren't going to grow. In other words, we're already seeing the effects of this. We're seeing the weather changes from the jets. In other words, the jets are actually modifying our climate and our weather because when they're up all the time, they do change the climate.
Yes.
And so we can't afford to be then adding particles and chemicals to do this. But see, here's the thing. There is no real governance on this. There is no public debate. There's only a group of climate scientists who are using scare tactics to say, well, the rain is falling and we've got to do something about it. But these climate scientists are not putting into any money on making jets more fuel efficient. They're not putting in any money on stopping the amount of water vapor from the jets going into the air. They're not doing any of these things to say, we want a permanent fix and we're going to devote our life and our scientific expertise to actually making life better here on Earth rather than putting up temporary fixes.
Yep, I agree totally. Rosalind, we're top of the hour, and we got some really nice flute Native American music. So let's just take a break for a few minutes, and we'll catch up with you on the second hour. I just am amazed things that you've said in this first hour, just like you did on the last program. Absolutely blowing me away, and a great education. I hope our audience is catching on to all this. We're just going to be back here in just a couple minutes for our second hour with Rosalind Peterson, and this is our special broadcast here on Living Light Network, Atmospheric Geoengineering Awareness Month. And it might be May 2011 right now, but this archive for this show is just as good next year and a decade from now. So hang in there. We'll all be right back in just a few minutes.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Rosalind Peterson, to me, the expert of what's going on in the skies. So I've got her back here on live. Rosalind, Sorry for the delay. Thanks for hanging in there. I have a question, something that I would like to know in more detail. We have all this going on in the skies, and it doesn't stay up there forever. It's all falling to the ground. Get into more detail of how, besides like you spoke about with the bees and we have this lack of vitamin D, what does this do to our crops, to the things that rely on the sunlight they're not getting, and what kind of things are they spraying up there that affect our crops? Because, to me, that's more important. If we don't have the food, we're in trouble.
Well, that's correct. Well, this is what I want to say first. Anytime that you start to reduce the amount of direct sunlight, you impact food crop production and how well and healthy our trees grow. You begin to affect life on Earth everywhere. In other words, without a single chemical, just by reducing the amount of sunlight, you're going to lower crop production. Your trees and your plants won't be as healthy. Now, for one thing I can say for a certainty is that where I live here in Mendocino County, we've only had about 5 days of direct sunlight here where the sun was up with blue skies, no man-made clouds, very little haze, but where we had direct sunlight all day. That's from January 1. That's a long time. And when you look at the native grasses that are growing, or you look at, in other words, planted crops like wheat or different things, what we're seeing is the native grasses here would normally be 5 or 6 feet high now by this time of the year. The cows would have enough to eat. You would see native grasses so high that you could hardly see the fences and the fence posts because they would grow taller than the height of the fences and the posts around here. And so the native grasses would be really thick and lush, and it would be hard to walk through them. In the last few years, because we've recorded such a dramatic shift in very little sunlight reaching the earth, last year the native grasses, and even though we had enough rainfall, it wasn't a drought, the native grasses only grew ankle high. So people were having to feed their cattle with something they purchased instead of just allowing them to graze on pastures because there wasn't enough feed. This year, the grasses are probably up about knee-high. The stalks are really weak. Where they used to, when things went to seed, you would have bountiful seeds and everything. The stalks are weak, very little seed on the stalks themselves, which means that next year, even if the sunlight came back and we had normal weather, you wouldn't see this. The corn crop production study from the University of Illinois specifically relates to the fact that if everything else is normal, if you have a increase in cloud cover, your corn crop production will drop. So you have tree health not having enough direct sunlight. You have human health. So even if you take away all the chemicals and you just say, look, just the man-made cloud cover from the jet is having a tremendous impact on the amount of direct sunlight reaching the earth, the consequences are dire for us over a long period of time because you're going to have less food. Your organic gardens aren't going to grow as well no matter what you do with them. But when you ask me, well, you wanted to know specifically, okay, if the jets are spraying something, what are they spraying and what is the impact? And you've asked me that a couple of times, and I've dodged that a little bit because I have been conducting research since 2002, and one of the first things that I wanted to know was exactly what these jets were doing, exactly what these jets might be spraying, exactly what the issues were, and the questions you just asked. That has been one of the things that I have been researching, and then it has led me down other paths because there was no clear answer to that, other than the EPA does record that jet fuel emissions have health effects, and I'll get into those in a second, so that the white plumes you see are filled with jet fuel emissions, which have a tremendous impact on the atmosphere. But rocket fuel and the space shuttle fuel and all of this is much more toxic than jet fuel and also has aluminum particulates in it. So every time the space shuttle goes up, an experiment is done, a rocket goes up, any of these fancy new aircraft that are going to take people into space, all of that is going to pollute our atmosphere to a tremendous amount. And they're much more toxic to agriculture, crops. They're much more toxic to a lot of things. So I wanted you to know that this is loaded with jet fuel and other chemicals, and that what the jets are doing are not benign in our atmosphere. Now, I have a subsonic jet emissions report from the EPA, evaluation of air pollutant emissions from subsonic commercial jet aircraft. This doesn't even include military, but the military uses even more profound fuels with more toxics in them than the JP4 used by commercial airlines. But this is what they said. Okay. They said EPA's principal concern in evaluating and controlling jet fuel emissions is the prevention of human health and secondarily the protection of public welfare, including protection against damage to crops, vegetation, animals, and buildings. And what they talk about, the pollutants in this jet fuel, they talk about lung function impairment, ozone, effects on physical performance and exercise. They talk about increased susceptibility to respiratory infection, increased hospital admissions and emergency room visits, pulmonary inflammation, lung structure damage, chronic inflammation and structural damage to lung tissues, and accelerated decline in baseline lung functions. Okay, they release carbon monoxide, cardiovascular effects, especially in those persons with heart conditions, and its similar health effects on animals as on humans. Their report goes on. Nitrogen oxides, lung irritation and lower resistance to respiratory infections, premature mortality, aggravation of respiratory and cardiovascular disease, changes in lung function, respiratory symptoms, et cetera, and it goes on. It says asthmatics are especially sensitive. And then the volatile organic compounds in jet fuel, eye and respiratory tract irritation, headaches, dizziness, visual disorders, and memory impairment. And then you have, they go on to list representative environmental effects, are crop damage, damage to trees, and decreased resistance to disease for both crops and other plants. Ground level ozone interferes with the ability of plants to produce and store food so that growth, reproduction, and overall plant health are compromised. By weakening trees and other plants, ozone can make plants more susceptible to disease, insect attack, and harsh weather. And this is something, in other words, the nitrogen oxides from the jet fuel, acid rain, visibility degradation, particle formation, contributes toward ozone formation, and it goes on and on and on.
Wow.
This is a 40-page report. Now, when you ask me, well, most people say, well, if you just see a small plume and it doesn't mean anything, yes, it does, because jet fuel emissions and also rocket fuel emissions impact us and our air quality, just like what comes out of your gas tank, except that it comes out in increasing tremendous amounts at increasing levels. And this is for both commercial and military applications. But when you start to put the military applications and start to circle our counties and do, in other words, almost like it looks like almost artwork up in the skies, the commercial airlines have to fly from point A to point B in a straight line. Mm-hmm. They don't have the fuel, the money, or the time to be jetting around in circles over and ovals and by the dozens over our counties and over the United States. The only personnel that would be able to do that would be military. The only paid mechanics, and the only groups that would be able to do this are the ones that have a lot of money and a lot of extra time to create grids and circles and ovals.
And unmanned aircraft, drones. They've been using them for years.
Possibly. I don't know.
No, definitely.
I can't speak to that because I don't think in the late 1980s that we had unmanned aircraft and drones leaving jet trails.
We definitely.
So I have a hunch that that's not quite possible at that time.
Well, I can tell you we did, and it was going on from the late 70s. So that's part of what I know from my military background. Anyway,
okay. Well, I'm good.
It's been going on for a long time. And even at the end of World War II, there were drone aircraft. There were full-size aircraft. But at the end of World War II, they had already figured out with radio frequency controls using servo motors. So I definitely know about that. So anyway,
okay.
just continue on with people don't think that's supposed to affect us. And can I add real quick, the
sure.
rocket fuel, you're out in California. You know where Lompoc is in Vandenberg Air Force Base. I had family. They've moved away recently, but had lived there for over 30 years, and I had been out there almost that long ago and more recent. Vandenberg Air Force Base has lots of things that take off at night and during the day, but especially at night, and even things that people have described as shuttles. And of course, that's an Air Force facility, and there are Air Force shuttles and such that are going up, but especially the Air Force satellites. Everything is done from Vandenberg, right there at Lompoc, and that's not too far from where you are. There's a lot of rocket fuel going there and a lot of health problems going on in the Lompoc area because of Vandenberg. I know that from family.
I'm sure of it.
Well, okay. I had to add that because that's my personal touch.
Well, that's great. I mean, you add to the knowledge, and that's really great.
Well, not great for my family, but it's just to reinforce what you said, and that's really a lot of the reason why they moved, and they went further east deliberately because they were retired military. And of course, the greatest PX or commissary in California is out there at Vandenberg, but they had problems with my cousins being sick all the time, and I'm sure a lot of that had to do over the years, over a couple of decades at the minimum, with all the rocket fuel and all the missiles going up and all that. So I wanted to add that that does exist. I have family that have talked about the health problems because of all those rockets and satellites and everything else going up. So there's my 2 cents. Just wanted to throw that in.
So the last question that I'll answer, that you had asked several times is, okay, what are the jets spraying? Because people, when you see the jets, it looks like they're spraying. You see the black trails, which we think are carbon black. You see all kinds of things going on in the air. And you see this stuff, it looks like particulates flowing down. You see the white haze. And so one of my principal portions of an investigation since 2002 was to find out what the jets were doing. Now, I can prove that the military jets are releasing aluminum-coated fiberglass particulates by the ton from U.S. Air Force documents and Navy documents, and that these float for about 20 hours and then eventually fall back to Earth, and they call it chaff. They are doing that. But when I go and I look at the unusual spiking in drinking water samples in the state of California, for example, from the State Department of Health Drinking Water Division in Sacramento, California, what I'm finding is that the spikes are unusual and inconsistent, but more consistent with rocket experiments that are being conducted where aluminum and barium, strontium, magnesium, trimethyl aluminum, aluminum oxide, and other experiments of putting these type of particles and chemicals into the atmosphere are conducted. The unusual spikes that I'm finding tend to be more closely related to these rocket-type experiments, or when the space shuttle goes up, different things when they conduct experiments, then it tends to be conducted with an overall spraying program where background, if there was something that was being sprayed in the water that got into the water from the jets, it falls into the drinking water everywhere. Tests would pick this up, and it would show on a consistent background level all of a sudden. And I'm not finding this, and that's the problem. I'm finding these unusual spikes, and I can relate them more to the rocket and the upper atmospheric rocket testing for the Navy and the Air Force and those type of entities than I can for the jets. But the problem is that I can't identify whether it's a jet release. I do know that aluminum particulates are in every rocket, all the rocket fuels. So, but it's hard for me then to figure out on the ground what the source of the pollution is from the jets directly or from these other rocket and other types of experiments. So I can find about 20,000 documents on the rocket experiments and university studies. There's everything, Pentagon reports, everything. NASA reports, NOAA reports. I mean, I've got so much on these rocket experiments, it's incredible. But when I start to do the research on the jets to get down to what they may be spraying on a consistent basis, it gets hard to separate out from the rocket experiments, and no one except for jet fuel and chaff talks about what the jets are doing that I can find. And this is my research since 2002, and I can tell you right now, if I knew, I would break the story.
Yes, I'm sure you would. All right, we've got all this about all the negative biosphere, basically, problems. Now, on our last show, when I had you on about a month ago, something blew me away that we actually did a video of, and you were talking about the financial end of all this weather, sky, stratosphere, all this manipulation that they're doing. And we talked about owning the weather and how the military was involved and all that. Let me go to something from that CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations meeting of March 10th of last year. And this was Steinbrunner, who I had quoted before. Now listen to what he said in this. Quote, and to add to that, there's a lot of liquidity running around the financial system looking for the next bubble. Then it says in parentheses, laughter, so they were all laughing about that. This is actually, the energy transformation is a very productive place to put your money. And you can make money doing that. And it's a productive result. So it doesn't appear to be, at least, hopeless to convince the markets that rather than go create some speculative Ponzi scheme, put money into a transformation we know we're going to need. And you can make a lot of money doing it. Whoever sort of gets the lead items in this area. And, you know, I think conceivably you can convince the markets that this is a good place to invest. Now, remember, they're talking about geoengineering in the skies here. All right, and then to finish this quote, and Granger is exactly right. The problem is to try to do it on a prudent schedule, not to wait until there's some kind of crash effort that has to be. They're talking, Rosalind, they're talking about we're creating something with this geoengineering that we can get rich off of which you talked about the last time that you were on my show, about the hedge funds at the Chicago Mercantile. Unbelievable. This is all part of such an amazing scheme. I'm baffled in one way, and I'm angry in the other, that they're messing with the ecology of our Earth, and at the same time taking hedge bets that they know they're going to win because they're controlling, or as you said, playing God of what happens in our atmosphere. And so they're getting rich off of what they're doing. Comments?
Well, yes. Well, let's go a little further for your audience right now, just briefly. Right now, there are a lot of weather modification programs that are ongoing across the United States and around the world. And you can bet on, with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, you can bet on the weather. You can bet on what kind of weather a certain area will have for a certain number of days. You can bet on how much rain will fall or how much snow will fall or whether there's going to be a drought. And all these weather modification companies in the United States know when these programs they're going to run. For example, Pacific Gas and Electric Company modifies the weather in California. So you could actually go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and bet that there's going to be increased snowpack in Plumas County, where they run one of their programs every year during certain months. And you see, you can go online and find out what month they're going to modify the weather and enhance the snow, and then you can bet on that. You can make a lot of money because everyone knows, NOAA, NASA, the government, everyone knows that these programs are ongoing. You can go to the Texas Regulatory Board in Texas, and you can look up their weather modification programs and when they're going to conduct them, and you can bet. So this is a massive Ponzi scheme of betting for those that know that weather modification is taking place and that it's public record and anyone can bet because they all know that this is happening. It's like betting on a sure thing. Well, the Ponzi scheme, what I did with geoengineering is I actually realized several years ago that the cap-and-trade bills that were the one that was passed in the U.S. House and the one that didn't pass last year, it was a climate bill, didn't pass last year in the U.S. Senate, thank goodness. And what they did is they were going to set up a market money scheme whereby they would cap pollution at a certain level from a factory, for example. And then on the market, they would take and they would sell credits on the market so that a polluter didn't have to reduce the amount of his pollution. He could, on the market, buy these credits so that he could continue to pollute at current or ever-increasing levels. This climate bill, which they're trying to drum up and pass again, would have a carbon tax attached to it, and that was how the geoengineers figured that they were going to fund their programs. They would get massive amounts of money, and they could say, well, we're benefiting the climate because we're going to cool the earth to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the earth, and therefore this is our scheme. And when there was a carbon tax and this passed, we would have unlimited amounts of money to not only engage in this process, one, but two, they could take their companies, this venture capitalist company, put this company on the market and sell the credits for benefiting the earth by reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the earth that was cooling us down. So therefore, they could make it both ways. They get money from the carbon tax to do the program through our tax dollars. Then they all have their companies, and what they were going to do is sell credits because their company was benefiting the earth, and they could now sell their credits to polluters.
Wow. So it's the same thing the financial industry is getting somewhat caught at now, though it hasn't been totally exposed yet. It's pretty close. About making derivative hedge fund bets on both sides of the game. So when the one agrees, okay, we're going to make the negative bet, and when we go bankrupt, you're going to absorb our company because you made the opposite. And what you're saying is this is really what's going on with the manipulations of what they're doing in our skies. It's the same thing.
It's the same thing. And here's the shocker. This is just a shocker. It's a sidelight, but it's a shocker. In California, the California government decided that they were going to take all the trees in California and make them worth a credit. Because, see, what they do is they take in carbon dioxide and they give off oxygen. So what they said is all the trees, whether it's a public tree in a park or a national forest or trees in your backyard, are all worth something. We will take and size them all up by type and size and age and circumference and diameter and all these things, and we will assign a credit to the trees. Then we will go and we will put these trees on the stock market, and we will make money because polluters can now buy the credits and use these trees as offsets, and they can pollute using the credits from these trees. Or like Nancy Pelosi and Governor Schwarzenegger did a couple of years ago, they bought tree credits in California, the benefits from our trees, and they said, well, we're going to buy these tree credits, and that'll offset our air pollution for our jet travel.
So they're actually trading on the financial market these carbon credits, which, we've all heard about that, but it's always been beyond, the average person to understand what that's all about. But you're explaining this great. So we're going to take a credit on a living tree and offset that against the pollution, basically from a jet. And they're playing both sides of the game, and yet they are manipulating what's happening in the air so that somebody is a loser and somebody is a winner.
Yes, but we're all losers in the end because...
Well, we are.
Sure. We are on the ground here, all losers on the end, because what it does, one man in Shasta County, he has thousands of acres of trees, and he was approached by one of these middlemen that sell credits on the stock market to, in other words, buy the credits for his trees. And so my friend says, well, you mean I'm supposed to take care of and maintain these trees? You buy the credits, because they give off oxygen, so you buy the credits to my trees. And then he said, and then you're going to sell it to a polluter who's going to continue to pollute at current or increasing rates, and that pollution is going to come back and kill my trees. He said it's no sale.
This is insane. It really is. It's immoral. I'll go 1,000,000% on that. But it's insane. Hedge betting, nature versus those who are manipulating the world through atmosphere and which affects the land and everything else. This is absolutely crazy, Rosalind. But sadly, it's true.
Oh, it's very true. You can go and take a look, and you see a lot of Al Gore's businesses that he was promoting were actually these cap-and-trade businesses that were going to sell these credits. And they needed the funding. He was desperate to get that cap-and-trade bill because all of these businesses that he was promoting, when you look at them, they were all going to be trading in these carbon credits. You could just go from one to another on his list of those that he belonged to or were running, and they were all cap-and-trade Ponzi schemes that they were going to be selling, and they needed to pass the climate bill and to sell the environmental groups and the people on passing this climate bill, which they're going to try to do again, in order to set up this cap-and-trade system.
But they're already trading it on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and I'm sure other places as well. This is really beyond corruption. I don't even have the words for this. It's beyond corrupt. It's beyond immoral. They're creating weather and sky happenings in order to make money. And this is what I hope is a big part of your atmospheric geoengineering awareness. This is all part of the game.
Yes, that's part of the game, and that's why I talk about cap-and-trade issues, and that's why I've been opposing these bills that we're trying to get through Congress, because I understand the game is a financial game. It's to set up another Ponzi scheme for the stock market. And see, the thing is that they did implement this and some of this in Europe. And what happens is that Germany and the French government and all these governments got taken to the cleaners by these Ponzi schemes that were set up. And now they even delay some trading, cap and trade, credit trading, because they have to check and see if this is legitimate or if this is another Ponzi scheme. So they delay the trades for usually 24 or 48 hours, or I don't remember how long, somewhere in that neighborhood, in order to find out if the trades are real or if they're fake trades.
So they're moving from the derivative falsified mortgage market and going now to the let's call it weather manipulation, sky gain market, atmospheric geoengineering market. And it's all for the reason of paper money. And yet the ones who suffer, no matter what the game is, are us and the earth. Sad. Really sad. Okay. You have to laugh sometimes. It just seems so absurd, Rosalind, that people who are pretending to be God of this earth do such absurd things. But, I guess that's the way it's always been, past and present and possibly future. It's not going to change. Okay, let me change the subject a little bit, even though I'm sure these hedge funds, these derivatives of weather manipulation and atmospheric manipulation have a lot to do with this. And I'm sure people are getting rich from what I want to bring up now. We talked about this a little bit last time. I'd love to give you about another 10, 15 minutes to let me know what's going on with the Gulf of Mexico. We didn't have any hurricanes last year after the Deepwater Horizon, and it was not a spill flow, which still continues because of the fractures in the Gulf flow, so on the floor of the Gulf. So we still have this flow of oil. We still have what is my big thing that I've investigated and I have proof of about synthetically modified bacteria changing the natural biosphere all around the Gulf of Mexico. We still have lots of problems here. And last year, for the first time, not a single hurricane came into the Gulf of Mexico. We talked about this before. I am predicting, simply for this reason, but I am predicting they will not allow any hurricanes to come up through the Gulf again in 2011 for the second year in a row, simply because if they stir up what they have done in the Gulf of Mexico, it will become worse than Fukushima with radiation, simply because when you have genetically modified bacteria eat up the oil and they combine through horizontal gene transfer with other bacteria that are natural, you have a worldwide pandemic on your hands. Now, you don't have to agree with that at all, Rosalind, but from your perspective, are they manipulating weather in the Gulf of Mexico now, and do you have any opinion or whatever that they will do that through this summer for whatever reason? It does, like I said, you don't have to agree with me, but what have you got to say that things are being manipulated in the Gulf of Mexico right now?
Well, I was really got suspicious about hurricanes when I learned that a private corporation back several years ago, Dynamac Corporation, was going to be working with NASA to put this polymer into these hurricanes. In other words, to absorb the moisture, and then this white powder would fall back to Earth because they practiced dissolving clouds with it.
How long ago was this? When did you learn about this? In other words, when did you figure out this was going on, and how long ago has this started?
Well, if you go to the weather modification section of the agriculturedefensecoalition.org, and I list a whole bunch of weather modification programs. One of them was an article in Popular Science, and it was a 2003 article that talked about weather modification with this private company, and they talked about dissipating clouds and doing experiments, and then they were going to initiate some hurricane experiments to reduce the force of hurricane or to use up the moisture in the hurricane by dropping this polymer into the hurricane. And that's when I first realized that NASA, private corporations, Bill Gates is now working on weather modification too with NASA, and they're doing any number of particular experiments that are going to modify hurricanes. So I've known about this for some time and was quite amazed as I began to read these articles about modifying hurricanes. Now, our history shows that in the 40s and 50s, there was really an intense amount of information that we did do some hurricane modification. One turned into a disaster, and so they sort of stopped for a while. But now they're getting really interested in redirecting hurricanes or dissipating them. And what I noticed after Hurricane Katrina is that there's been very little in the way of hurricanes that have been on land. Most of them take weird patterns, are deflected off, or have there's other things going on. So we haven't seen a lot of hurricane activity in the Gulf of Mexico. We've seen them mostly deflected, or they either deflect them toward Cuba or toward Haiti areas or Texas at the tip of Texas in the ocean. They direct them in that direction lower, or they seem like they direct them up along the eastern seaboard and out back into the Atlantic.
Or even the one that tried to get into the Gulf of Mexico through the south tip of Florida last year, it just dissipated. It was nothing more than a thunderstorm by the time it hit the area Deepwater Horizon.
Yes, that's correct. So you've got Bill Gates talking about hurricane modification and putting some money into this, as well as other cloud whitening and other geoengineering experiments. You've got NASA actively engaged with these private individuals. And then when you add, for example, MIT Professor Emanuel is a very fascinating gentleman. He was on a Discovery Channel program. And during the course of this Discovery Channel program, he began to talk about, which fascinated me, this idea that you could take a fleet of jets and you could cover the West Coast with carbon black. And they even showed a graphic of it. It was amazing on this Discovery Channel program. And he was talking about if you put up this carbon black, you can start these because carbon black absorbs heat as a particulate, soot essentially is what it is. You can start these weather fronts moving across the United States, and you can escalate their intensity as they move across the United States, so that if you have it arrive about the same time as a hurricane would start to come on land, that you would deflect it off because there would be so much momentum going across the United States from this storm that you could deflect it off the coast so it wouldn't make landfall.
Now, you have all this referenced on your sites. Which internet site?
agriculturedefensecoalition.org. It's in the weather modification section of I've got it in PDF files, And also I've got a link to a video there too as well.
Okay,
but we have this.
You're putting on there things that these people have said, and this is not your opinion.
No.
So I want to make that clear. This is what is on record, and you have these files on there on that site.
And you can still go to the Discovery Channel if you need to and just type in this program about hurricane control, and because it was a program regarding hurricane control. And what you can do is you can look at that program. I mean, it's about an hour program when they talk about weather modification. This was one portion of the program, which I found to be utterly, unbelievably fantastic that we had decided. But see, there was something else that bothered me about this. One, you would have to start carbon black trails, and we see black trails here. We're blitzed with them. Just before these weather fronts start across the United States that get very intense. And we can almost predict from the black trails that we see here and the black in the clouds, because it gets to the bottom of the clouds, that they're starting one of these intense storms moving across the United States.
They've
and
seen
we
this
can
in the
tell
southern
that
U.S.
the Midwest, we can watch it intensify. And people have said, as this moves across, they say, yeah, we see the black trails, and then all of a sudden we see these storms just appear and intensify as they move all the way across the East Coast.
Well, they've seen this in the southern U.S. and Arkansas, Tennessee, where we've had all these tornadoes in the past 3 weeks. They have seen the same thing. It's even been on some newscasts on local stations only, where just exactly what you're saying about these black lines, even on a radar, show up before the actual tornadoes come. And it's not a front by a typical weather front. It's something that even the meteorologists on the TV stations and local levels can't really explain.
Yeah, they can't explain it or where these pop up, and they don't know where it is, or the unusual lightning. See, we know that the military is doing lightning experiments. Some of the universities are. So there's all kinds of experiments going on. But see, when we see the black trails here, I have been watching the Weather Channel and all these things, and I watch it, and you can say, okay, here's the front. You can see it heading across, intensifying as it hits across. So everybody between the West Coast and the East Coast gets these highly intensive storms that would be highly unusual. And we think that they're kicking them off on the West Coast at various areas so that this carbon black will move, as MIT Professor Emanuel talks about, and there's another paper written on this as well. But these papers talk about this, and then it's supposed to deflect these hurricanes. Well, Professor Emanuel says, well, we're doing this for the good of mankind because we can deflect these hurricanes. But the program, the Discovery Program channel said, well, we're not so sure. Some people from NOAA said, well, we're not exactly so sure because the churning of the hurricanes in the oceans makes them come alive again, because it takes the sediment on the bottom and it churns it up and it makes the ocean come alive again. It's not so, because without them they kind of think the ocean bottoms and the oceans would die. And so what it does is it churns up all these nutrients in the ocean, and they say the hurricanes have some beneficial use here, even though they create some destruction.
Very
but
much
I
in
think
the oceans.
that when Professor Emanuel began to talk about this, they were already starting to engage in the experiment at that time.
Oh, sad. So, in other words, perhaps the financial hedge bets came in there. So, well, we've got I'm going to give you about 2 minutes here. We're towards the end of the last hour. This has been really enlightening, to say the least. Let me give you a couple minutes. What is it, the most important thing that you want everybody to know about atmospheric geoengineering awareness? What's the most important thing you got? Lay it out there. You got a couple minutes, and we're going to end this show.
Well, the most important thing is to really realize that the state of technology, the state of our ability to do things at ever-increasing levels, and the state of, in other words, what we think can be done versus the reality of what we can now do sometimes is it's almost undefinable. The other thing that I think is really important to know is that we're doing this because we have the money, we have the capability, we like to do the experiments, and there's no ethical or moral anyone sitting in that seat saying, look, we shouldn't be using the Earth as our experimental physics laboratory. You can read about all this. I put it together on my website, but all of the documents there are still online as far as I know, and I encourage everyone to read up and learn that the fantastic is no longer the fantastic, it's a reality, and in many cases we're suffering the consequences. And so I hope that you will join us in Geoengineering Month and educate others as well.
Just give your websites again, the two of them that I've looked at, or if you have others, and even your Facebook, if you know what that is, because I know now you're on Facebook. So a lot of people are there that don't go on the Internet. So give all your info so people can check this out.
Okay, well, CaliforniaSkywatch.com, it's all spelled out, is a website that talks a lot about the jets. It has photographs, all kinds of information on it that talks about weather modification and other programs. The Agriculture Defense Coalition works interchangeably with California Skywatch. It's called agriculturedefensecoalition.org. And I hope all of you will join us and move forward with learning more about all of these interesting topics and what's happening.
Okay, and I know you're on Facebook somewhere, so people can just go California Skywatch on Facebook and they'll find you.
Yes.
Fantastic. Rosalind, thank you again. This is our second time. I'm very privileged to have you on again. You've been on many, many more important shows than ours. Thank you for being on Living Light Network, for informing people, for giving me an education as everybody else. So thank you again for taking the time. I appreciate it. And you got a lot of research, and it's delightful to talk with somebody like you, and you're more than informative. Again, I'm always at a loss for words. I was last time when you were on. You just blew me away. So, again, thank you, Rosalind. I appreciate it so much, and so does everybody listening, even in the archives. Thanks for informing us.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you again for having me on your show.
Okay. Thanks again. Appreciate it. All right, so that was Rosalind Peterson, CaliforniaSkywatch.com, her main site. Thank you for being here, and always be who you were created to be. This is Michael Edward. We'll catch you next time. And I didn't find what I just mentioned on your site. I got a feeling it's there, but that just amazed me. That March 10th from last year, they were talking about hiding the facts of geoengineering in the skies.
That's correct. And hello, and thank you for having me on your show again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on, because I learned a lot last show, and I can't wait to learn more now.
Well, this is a fascinating subject, and it's a subject that has been talked about since the 1990s, when it was introduced by Edward Teller of Lawrence Livermore Lab and some other gentlemen, and they started writing papers about this years ago, thinking that they could put chemicals or particles into the sky for various types of experiments. One of them, which is to supposedly reduce global warming by putting particles and chemicals into the atmosphere to reduce the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. Mm-hmm. And this atmospheric geoengineering has actually been going on for some time, because we see the skies filled with jet contrails from one end to the other, and a lot of times they put so much cloud cover up, which NASA talks about in their studies. And NASA has said that persistent jet contrails do turn into man-made clouds. They do exacerbate global warming. They do change the climate, and they do negatively impact natural resources. And the Stanford University studies, which I put some of them on my website, I also attended last month the Commonwealth Club Symposium on this subject, and we talked about geoengineering there. But we talked about the impact that this reduction of direct sunlight is having on the earth, on agriculture, on crop production, water and air pollution. And so now we have a group of so-called climate scientists who are actively engaged in promoting geoengineering schemes so that they can put up these particles like sulfur or aluminum possibly into the atmosphere so that they can reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the earth. They are talking about cloud whitening experiments where they put salt, finely ground salt particulates into clouds, and then those clouds become more reflective and white and reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the earth. And then finally these salt particles rain out over land, and they pollute our water and our soil and our forest land because salt water starts to make the land and the soils unproductive and requires more. It's going to change the fishing for freshwater fishing and other things as these particles rain out more and more over land areas. So the experiments are in the oceans. Ocean iron fertilization has also been underway by both private companies and experimental projects, and they're finding that it's a disaster in the oceans because it's creating these artificial algae blooms which kill the fish and don't do what they say they're going to do. In other words, reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. They actually cause other types of problems. So the ocean iron fertilization has been kind of stalled a little bit, although private companies can still do this without public consent, government consent. The U.S. House Science and Technology Committee started to hold hearings along with the U.K. Parliament in England in 2009, and they only had climate scientists who wanted to do these type of projects testify before them. They didn't ask scientists from any other fields. For example, they didn't have anyone represented from agriculture, no one represented from fish and game, no one represented from, in other words, ocean scientists, marine biologists.
Of course not.
They had nobody testify either at the UK Parliament or at the U.S. House Science and Technology hearings, of which 3 have been held since 2009. And they had decided that they would only have those testify who wanted to promote these experiments. And the UK Parliament report, which came out on March 10th, 2010, the 5th report, even talked about the fact that they had initiated some of these geoengineering experiments without public notification, without public consent, no oversight, nothing. That they had started to use our atmosphere as a giant physics laboratory to conduct their experiments. Now that means that we here in the United States are the human guinea pigs for these types of experiments. And one of the things that I can say without a doubt is that when you read the U.S. House Science and Technology report, which came out in October 2010, or if you read anything about global geoengineering governance, they're talking about having some sort of governance so that they can go ahead and experiment on the Earth's atmosphere and on us, and that these projects have unintended consequences. For example, if you put sulfur up, then you're going to have acid rain, which is going to impact your forests. The acid rain will change the pH in your rivers and streams. It's going to cause loss of crop production, when you remove direct sunlight from reaching the Earth.
Now, some of the things that Rosalind would possibly talk about. Like I said, on her site, she's got so much information. You're never, in a week, you're not going to get through it all. So let me quote the Council on Foreign Relations from March 10th, 2010, with their meeting on developing an international framework for geoengineering. And this is a quote from the gentleman I just mentioned. First of all, of course, there's a lot of money getting spent to make sure that a very substantial portion of the public stays totally confused about this. And he was talking specifically about geoengineering. And I mean, it's been really quite pernicious, but there's been literally tens of millions of dollars spent on every little thing that comes along that might, relate to some uncertainty. And that's the end of his quote. You know what he's saying? Tens of millions of dollars are spent on misinformation about geoengineering, especially when it comes to the climate. And that's what their meeting was all about. Again, this is not a secret. Just go to their site. Then you find out for yourself. It's right there on the internet, www.cfr.org. And look under their climate change section. And it's the title of it is Developing International Framework Geoengineering. If you want to get technical, it's on page 21651. Anyway, it's there now. Maybe after this broadcast to make sure that it's not there. I don't know. But that's what today's show is all about. I had Rosalind on here, like I said, almost a month ago. But let's put it this way. She really couldn't mention a percent of what she knows in 2 hours. And let's consider this part 2, and it will also deal, besides the atmospheric geoengineering awareness, we'll also deal with what's going to happen with hurricane season this month in the Gulf, because that's my thing. That's my show on every Friday. You can catch me tomorrow on Friday with a Gulf Blue Plague update right here on Blog Talk Radio at Living Light Network. So, without wasting any more time so that you can get all the info that you need, I've got Rosalind here alive now, and Rosalind absorb in a week on those 2 sites. I want to mention something real quick before. I'm sorry, I made a mistake, and I just got told. It's Agriculture Defense Coalition.org, O-R-G, not .com. Agriculture Defense Coalition.org. All right, and there's also California Skywatch.com. All right, before I introduce my fantastic guest who thinks that she's retired, now is probably busier than she's ever been since she thought she retired. I found something that I don't even know if this is on her sites. I didn't see it. All of you have heard of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. Okay, yeah, it's not conspiracy theory, anything. If you want to find that organization, just go on the internet. Go to www.cfr.org, and you can find out that they really do exist. Well, they have something on there that I thought was really interesting, considering that this is our geoengineering atmospheric month, as Rosalind has declared. I saw in there something that came from March 10th of last year, 2010. And it's on the CFR site. This is the title, Developing an International Framework for geoengineering. And I'm going to be honest, I never heard the term geoengineering until Rosalind was my guest almost a month ago here on Living Light Network. And I was on my Blue Plague show where we were talking about how the weather is manipulated and also how it affects the Gulf of Mexico with their lies that's going on now, their big cover-up. But this comes from the actual CFR.org site. I don't know why they say .org. It should be .com. But it's from March 10th, 2010, and it's in their climate change section. And they had a gentleman on there that this is all in print, and it's also been in videos. I've seen it on YouTube. M. Granger Morgan, who is the head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Now, there's a big research university. Well, he came out with some really weird things during this particular March 10th last year, 2010 meeting that they had with the CFR. And I thought, this is really, really, really odd. I had never seen this before. I was doing some searches today to try to find out. Welcome to Living Light Network and a very special Thursday broadcast. Well, how do you like your weather? Natural or man-made? That's what you're going to find out today. Because you're going to find out that your weather really isn't so natural. And the man-made part is probably about 95% of the equation, at least if you live in the industrialized world, which includes Europe and here in North America and even Central America, some parts of South America. Our weather is not natural anymore. And I have a guest on this special broadcast, Rosalind Peterson, will be on shortly, who has studied this for years. She said she was retired, and she retired from her normal world job. But I think she's a whole lot less than retired now than she ever thought she'd be. In fact, she's working harder at bringing out truth about what's going on in our atmosphere, much harder now than she ever did when she had her real job. So just to introduce a little bit about what we're going to talk about, Rosalind has declared this month, May 2011, as atmospheric and geoengineering. I'll get this right. Let's start again. Atmospheric Geoengineering Awareness Month. And it happens to be May 2011 right now. And she declared it for a reason. Now, there's a misleading word that a lot of people use. They claim we have chemtrails. What you're going to find out today is that is a very misleading term. It's way beyond chemical trails in the sky. It's way beyond that. And if you're in our chat, you can see right now all the sites where Rosalind has all this information. Let me just say them on the air for those who are listening in archives. Go on the internet to CaliforniaSkywatch.com. And then a second site with just as much, actually more information, is another site that Rosalind has put up, Agriculture Defense Coalition. These are all just one word, agriculturedefensecoalition.com. And then you also have the one I just mentioned, California Skywatch, one word, californiaskywatch.com. If you want to get informed of what's really in the atmosphere and understand exactly how it's man-made and has nothing to do with natural weather, then you need to go to those sites. There's more information than you could absorb